Man, I'm just trying to mix this song, and I can't tell if these instruments are too loud or too quiet, and I can't tell if there's too much frequency spectrum overlap, especially in these panned instruments. What's a guy to do? I just wish there was a magical button I could press that would collapse all of this to the center so I could see what's going on. Wait a second. What's this? Boop. Mono. Let's talk about mixing in mono. Not only why to do it, but how to configure your setup so that one signal comes out of two speakers, and how to effectively use these techniques to better your stereo mixes. And this all begs the question, in this present year, should we even be concerned with mono compatibility? Let's talk about it. Why does mono matter? It does matter, but not as much as online discussion would have you believe when everything is just of the utmost importance and we just have to argue about it. Mono matters in the extent that it exposes problems in your stereo mix. The reality is, like 97%, I made that up, but 97% of music listening is in stereo. So when do we hear mono? Maybe somebody standing off to the side of speakers. They're not in the sweet spot. That might sound a little more like mono. Or if they're in the club, who's even going to clubs? And when they're in the club, are they paying that much attention to the quality? But clubs do play mono. If somebody's at the lake and they're listening on a little Bluetooth speaker, they're not paying attention to the music. It's just ambiance. And let's say your music's playing on AM radio. Congratulations, nobody cares because everybody expects AM radio quality to suck. So mono matters, but not in the reasons you might think. It matters because it exposes problems in our stereo mixes. So yeah, we want to nail the mono mix, and there are a couple of peculiarities you'll have to learn to live with because you can't get them right in both mono and stereo. So you have to learn to live with the problems in mono because you never let the mono mix matter more than the stereo. The quality of the stereo mix always outweighs the mono. And I'm going to show you a decision I made regarding that too. So the question becomes, how do we configure our setup to provide us a mono signal? There's three ways, and let me show you the first one. I've busted out the phone, and look, right here on my desk, I can just reach forward. This is the Monicon passive monitor controller. All I have is a volume knob, a mute, and then I can just reach forward and go, boop, I'm in mono. Easy. The second way you're going to get into mono, which I suspect you'll do and the majority of people, is you'll come into your DAW software and you'll look for one of two plugins. Now, the first one, you'll see this online and it's a lot of extra clicks, so I don't recommend it. And depending on your DAW, it may have a different name, but this is the directional mixer. And what it does is it lets you try to get an extra wide mix, but you just take the spread from 1 and you drop it to 0, no matter if you're in stereo left and right or you're worried about mid-side. Either way, you're going to drop your spread to 0. Now look, now you're trying to return, you got to sit here and drag and do all this stuff. Nonsense. The easy way is to grab a gain plugin and put it at the end of your plugin stack and keep everything at unity. No extra gain or anything. And if you look at the bottom right, you have a mono off and a mono on. Now look, just leave it on. And when you want to go into mono, just turn the plugin on and off. I'm in mono, I'm out. I'm in mono. That's just as simple as having a passive monitor controller. So that's the second way. There's a third way, and people have a legitimate discussion to be had here, which is, why are we trying to listen to a mono signal out of two speakers? If we truly want mono, we'll do all the routing, whether through our DAW or a patch bay or a more complex monitor controller than I have, to get the whole signal coming out of one speaker. That would be true mono. Now, what you'll often see, I can't remember the name of these little monitors, but you'll find these little square ones, and you'll see people will set them centered between their stereo speakers, like a center channel in a 5.1 mix, but they're using it strictly for mono, and its frequency spectrum sucks. it doesn't have a whole lot of bass and it doesn't have a whole lot of high end. So you're just listening to the mids, which is where most of the action is happening and most of the overlap you're concerned with in mono. So that's perfectly sufficient. My qualm with that is that you want to deal with mono in the same way that the majority of your listeners will be, which is with multiple speakers, whether that's in the car with AM radio or in the club with speakers all over the place. Multiple speakers. Because what this allows you to do is to pop in and out of mono, which helps you deal with phase more easily. If you're stuck in mono on one speaker and you've got to go through all this configuration to get out, you're not going to be able to do the quick comparison. And you want to be in and out of mono a lot. You're not going to pop in mono and stay. You're going to keep checking in at various phases of your mix. So having two speakers at least provide you mono is going to make phase real obvious. That's the first problem we'll talk about of several. We've talked about not only why to mix in mono when we're trying to benefit a stereo mix, but how to configure it. But now the question is, what are we doing as we listen in mono? There's four main things. The first thing we're going to do is set our levels. So look, we're going to turn on our gain plugin, which now has us in mono. Let's double check. Yes, mono is on. And I've got the chorus looped, and I've muted some of these broadly panned instruments because we're going to talk about them later. This is the stuff that would have been up the center anyway, minus some toms, which are spread out, and the hi-hats, which I have panned off to the left. Let's give it a quick listen. So the question is, well, where are you going to start? I like to start at the lower frequencies. So I've brought up the kick and the bass and got them to almost equal levels in terms of the fundamental frequencies and maybe the first overtones. Get them sitting right together. I'm not worried about anything else, just the levels right now. And this is something we'll talk about in the future, but there's like level 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 coming towards you in loudness. Kick and bass, I want them sitting around level 2 right there together, not 2.5 or anything, about level 2. Then I'm going to push up the fader on the snare, and I want to run that up till it comes forward to basically level 2 where the kick and the bass are. You might end up backing that off depending on what style of mix you're doing. So just listen to the snare here versus the kick and bass as one unit. So remember, we're in mono, but these three instruments I've just mentioned, kick, bass, snare, are all going to be mono and up the center anyway. So once you set these levels, they're pretty much dialed in. You're going to tweak them some as you do other signal processing, but at least you can get these foundational elements in. And then we need to look at the hi-hats, which I do have panned off to the left some, and the toms, which are panned a little bit, not wide, just a little bit. So they're close enough to the center that we can also get their levels in. Where do we want the hi-hats? Maybe just behind the snare, maybe back to level 3 or 2.5. Where do we want the toms? Probably up to 2 with the snare. So just listen to how this is laid out. So here in mono, I feel like I've been tweaking this mix. I feel like those toms need to be louder. And that's very obvious when I'm in mono. That wasn't obvious in stereo and in the grand context of the full mix. So that's the first thing. And hey, you can set your levels in mono even for panned elements, but we're going to save that for the fourth thing. So what's the second thing that's easy to do in mono? EQ. We need every element to have its own spot in the mix. And if low frequency is down and higher frequencies are going up, just like volume is coming forward and back, they need to sit in their own little spot. There can be, there can be overlap, but they need to dominate, and that overlap needs to not conflict so much. And it comes down to arrangement too, instrumentation as well, picking out your instruments, but we don't want too much overlap, and we want to allow everything to dominate its own region. How to achieve that? We might start in the low frequencies. With kick and bass, we might be ducking, multiband compression, dynamic EQ. static parametric EQ and just carving out little spots, I probably wouldn't do that because the kick is such a transient instrument, but you'll dial that in. Then you're going to start looking at your snare. Does the snare have too much low content, mid-low, to where it's getting in the way of the higher part of the kick that lets you latch onto the kick? Is it bleeding all the way down into the upper regions of the bass? You need to deal with some of that too. And we're not talking about just taking a shelf and bloop, slapping it out or a roll off. There can be overlap. You just need to get the balance of it right. Same thing with the toms. They're going to be massive and boomy. So how much of that low end are you going to take out of there? Especially even more when it's in a full mix like this chorus. A lot of stuff is muted, but same thing with the hi-hats and the snares. Let the hi-hats probably dominate a higher frequency. Get that snare sitting below and allow some overlap. The third thing that mixing in mono allows us to do, and the reason I say to have two speakers, is that it lets us check phase problems. I'll explain phase. Phase is when you've got elements panned out, and maybe you took you didn't get two different tracks of guitar, so you took the same one, you added some delay, maybe you did a pitch shift of a cent or something to try to get them different. But when they sum to mono, do their waves, is there constructive interference where when the two peaks come together that they get way too loud? Or is there destructive? This is what we're concerned with phase mostly. Destructive interference where a part of the wave goes up and a similar part goes down and they cancel each other out. Things start sounding like wispy and weird, almost like a phaser. That's what why a phaser is called that. So that's why I was saying earlier, you do want to listen to mono out of two speakers because you can pop in and out. It makes it easier to hear that phasing, but there's also tools that can measure it. So let me show you this. In Logic Pro, there's a correlation meter. Now, let me unmute. We'll go solo on these choirs here. Now, this correlation meter, what this means is 0 is you've got the maximum width. You're panned 60 and negative 60, and everything's fine. There's no problem. +1 is they're perfectly in phase. You're not going to hear differences. You're not going to get any width. It's going to sound like mono because they're the exact, you take a track, duplicate it, push one to the left and push one to the right. They're the same track. You're not going to hear a difference. You're going to get a +1. A 0 is you've got maximum width and there's no phase issues at all. You're never going to get it just landing on 0, but dancing is fine. -1 is we're canceling out bad and you've got huge phase problems. So listen to this choir and watch the correlation meter and just see where I'm landing. That's the high-pitched chorus part. Let's look at a verse part. We're dancing around 0, but we're shooting off towards -1 and towards +1 at the same time. Is there some phase problems there? Yes. I don't have two instances of a chorus, and I'm playing the same chords on this digital instrument, so I did what I could. Do I care? No, it's close enough to 0, and like we said, 97% of listening is going to be in stereo. I think that's fine. We're dancing around maximum width without phase issues. Good. Let's check out the guitar here. How's this doing? No phase issues whatsoever. So let me show you an example of how we get the +1. I took that guitar MIDI and I moved it down to new tracks and I just slapped up some random electric piano and I panned one side hard left and I panned one side hard right. No buses, anything. So it should just be perfect duplicates on both sides. That should just slam us to the +1. Let's check it out. Slam to the +1. I even turned the mono plug-in off to make sure That's zero phase problems, but there's zero width. They're the exact same. So it sounded to me like it was coming straight out of the center. Look, we're back in stereo because I want to show you this. Here's our bass. I had a bass and it's straight up the center and it has all this like 300 to 500 hertz and a little higher. And I rolled all that off. I got rid of it. But I duplicated it and I inverted that to where I kept that 300 to 500 and I got rid of the bass and sub bass so that I could isolate that high end stuff. And I put a chorus on it. What a chorus is a bunch of delays, but the timing of the delays is controlled by an LFO, a low frequency oscillator. So it's constantly changing. And the reason you get this chorus effect is because you're creating phase problems. But what it does is instead of taking one copy of this higher frequency bass, painting it left, making a copy, painting it right, changing them so they don't clash, and I'm more at the 0 on the correlation meter, I just kept the 1 and I put a chorus. And what it does is it, instead of having 2 instances, it kind of smears the 1 out across the full width. But you get phase problems. Did I care? No, because that's the sound I wanted to go for, and I'm not too concerned with mono. And when you start bringing in all these other instruments, it's going to help fix some of that anyway. But look, here's just the bass and sub bass. Then I'm going to unmute and bring in the stereo so you can hear it, and then I'll stop and tell you the next part. Here's the bass and sub bass. You can hear some of that 3 to 500 because I left some in there when I rolled off because I did want something stable in the middle for when there's mono, phase issues. I did want some stability. Now look, let me mute that. Here's just the stereo, that 3 to 500 that I spread out with the chorus. And look at the correlation meter here. We're at like negative 0.5, meaning there is phase issues. Now let's go into mono, and now you can hear the phase issues. Well, I'm gonna pop in and out so you can hear the difference, and you can hear how it kind of gets thin and kind of tinny when you hear the phase issues in mono. So here's stereo. Nice spread out. Like butter. Now here's the phase issues in mono. Popping out. Going back to mono. You hear how the volume comes down and it gets real thin. That's because you're getting that deconstructive interference where the waves are canceling each other out. Now listen to them together in stereo. Even together there, we're getting a +1 on the correlation meter. So what I'm saying is, yeah, you're still going to hear some phase issues, but the more instruments you bring in, the less that's going to be a problem because there's so much other stuff going on in that 3 to 500 hertz range. So don't be scared of some problems in the correlation meter because we're always going to put stereo mixes over the mono mix, always. Okay, the fourth thing that we want to be dealing with in mono is panning. And you're not going to hear any of it in mono, but what you're going to hear is the effect on the levels. This is a peculiarity of mono because there's something called the pan law. Think about this. If you take a single instance of a sound and you're running it up the middle, that's the volume, right? If you take that single instrument and you start panning it to the left, you're now only pushing out of one speaker instead of two, and you're losing essentially half the power. So the volume actually comes down when you're panned. So what the pan law does is it compensates for that. So look, here's centered, and we're coming down 1 decibel, 2 decibel, 3 decibels when you're pushed far left or far right. And so the pan law compensates for that. Your DAW will have this, and you can go in the settings. You can go 0 pan law, -3 decibels pan law or +6 decibels. 3's fine. I think that's what it actually is meant to be. And it compensates by giving you +3 when you pan so that the levels remain stable. But even with that, we still as humans are going to perceive these wider sounds louder, even though they're at the same level thanks to the pan law set up in the DAW. So watch what happens when we take, it doesn't matter, we'll take these choruses and we're going to play them in stereo, then I'm going to drop them to mono, and watch how you perceive the volume dropping by 3 decibels. This is stereo. Now let's pop into mono. That seems significantly quieter. Let's do it again with the guitars. Here's stereo. Now we're dropping to mono. Again, it seems thinner. Let's do it in the full mix so that you can hear how certain elements, you can identify which ones are panned. It's going to be that choir, and then it's going to be that guitar. Even the hi-hats a little bit. They're going to seem too quiet. Here it is. Now we're dropping to mono. Now the kick and the snare sound entirely too loud. That's the peculiarity with panning and dealing with mono. If you got wide pan instruments and you drop to mono, you can get in this endless loop where you're like, oh, this is too quiet. Let me push it up about 3 decibels. And then you go back to stereo and you're like, man, this is too loud by 3 decibels. You'll sit there and chase your tail when the reality is, even with the compensation of the pan law in place, we're going to perceive wider instruments as louder. It's just how, it's psychoacoustics is how it works. So accept the fact that they're going to sound too low in mono. I wouldn't even try to get like the best of both worlds. Just accept that it's too low in mono. Get it right in stereo. That's where you want to be. Mixing in mono is a pretty big skill for you to remember to check in with. I'd say like 10 to 15% of your mix time should be spent in mono, but it doesn't have to all be at once. You just want to check in and hop back out just to make sure at different phases of the mix that everything is still gelling with general mono compatibility, especially with panned instrument volumes. And remember, when it comes to panning volume levels, always let the stereo mix win. Now, if you like this discussion and you want to learn why there's this panning volume discrepancy, this next video, I'm going to tell you about the pan law and why this happens. So check this out if you want to learn, and if you don't, hasta lasagna.